Your tests are all normal. The doctor says everything is fine. But you notice, fatigue sets in after eating. Your belly keeps growing even though you're not eating more than before. Sweet cravings hit with a force that feels impossible to ignore. An hour after a full lunch, you're hungry again. You feel something has changed. Today, as a nutritionist, I'll explain why these symptoms appear long before tests show anything, and why fenugreek is one of the most studied plant tools for working with insulin sensitivity. Let me start with a description of how insulin resistance manifests at the very beginning, before it becomes visible in tests. There are several characteristic patterns people notice themselves but rarely connect to each other. First pattern, post-lunch drowsiness and fatigue. You ate a substantial meal, and 30 to 40 minutes later, you literally can't keep your eyes open. You want to lie down. Working is impossible. Within an hour and a half it passes, but by then you've already eaten something sweet to perk up. That's exactly what post-lunch hypoglycemia looks like on the background of hyperinsulinemia. A sharp insulin rise after eating leads to excessive blood sugar reduction, and the body demands fuel. Second pattern, belly grows with the same eating. Visceral fat, fat around internal organs, is simultaneously both a consequence and an amplifier of insulin resistance. Visceral adipocytes are themselves more insulin resistant. They release pro-inflammatory cytokines that additionally reduce peripheral tissue sensitivity. That's why waist circumference is one of the most significant practical markers of metabolic health, often more informative than simply total weight. There are specific threshold values. For women, more than 80 centimeters in the waist indicates elevated metabolic risk, more than 88, high. For men, more than 94 and more than 102 centimeters respectively. Exactly these numbers the WHO recommends as practical guidelines for metabolic disorder screening without any tests. Third pattern, irresistible craving for sweets and fast carbohydrates. This isn't weak will, it's neurochemistry. With insulin resistance, brain cells also receive less glucose, despite sufficient amounts in the blood. The brain signals hunger through the dopamine reward system. There's an interesting fact about this mechanism. Hypothalamic neurons that regulate food behavior respond not to blood glucose levels, but to the rate of cellular glucose uptake. With insulin resistance, uptake is slowed, and the hypothalamus gets a too little energy signal even with sufficient glucose levels. That's exactly why diets based exclusively on caloric restriction work significantly worse with insulin resistance. Hunger has a neurochemical nature, not merely behavioral. That's exactly why cravings for sweets with insulin resistance have an almost compulsory character. This isn't a whim, it's a neurobiological response to energy deficit at the cellular level. Fourth pattern, hunger 1 to 1.5 hours after eating. You ate. It was sufficient. But shortly after, you're hungry again, though physically there couldn't have been time to become empty. This is the paradox of hyperinsulinemia. Insulin is high, but cells don't respond to it properly. Blood sugar drops, hunger arises, despite having enough calories. There's a practical way to distinguish this hunger from ordinary hunger. Ordinary hunger builds gradually, 3 to 4 hours after eating. Reactive hunger with hyperinsulinemia is acute and sudden, 1 to 1.5 hours later, exactly at the moment when the insulin peak caused excessive glucose reduction. Exactly this suddenness and acuteness, an important diagnostic sign. Fifth pattern, difficulty concentrating and brain fog. The brain is the organ with the highest glucose consumption in the body. With disrupted glucose delivery to neurons, cognitive function suffers. Hard to concentrate, maintain attention, think clearly. Exactly this symptom is described as brain fog, a feeling of blurry thinking that many attribute to fatigue or stress. What unites all these symptoms? They appear before fasting glucose goes beyond normal range, before glycated hemoglobin becomes elevated. Insulin resistance is a state that exists for years before the diagnosis of prediabetes is made. And exactly in this period, when symptoms are already there, but tests are still normal, nutritional correction is most effective. Now, mechanisms. I'll explain as a nutritionist, precisely and to the point. Let me start with the basics. Insulin resistance is a state where body cells become less sensitive to insulin. Insulin is a key, and the receptor on the cell surface is a lock. In this state, the lock becomes stiff. The key arrives, but the door opens poorly. Glucose can't fully enter the cell. First mechanism, chronic hyperinsulinemia as a response to resistance. The pancreas sees that glucose is poorly leaving the blood and compensatorily releases more insulin. While the gland manages, blood sugar remains normal. That's exactly why tests are normal, but insulin level is already significantly above normal. This can be checked not just with fasting glucose, but with HOMA-IR index, the ratio of fasting insulin to fasting glucose. Exactly this indicator allows detecting insulin resistance before glucose has gone beyond normal range. There's a practical HOMA-IR interpretation guide. Value up to 2.5, norm. From 2.5 to 4, mild insulin resistance. Above 4, pronounced resistance, requiring active intervention. Exactly this simple calculation gives the doctor and patient an objective starting point for tracking dynamics. Second mechanism, chronic inflammation and mitochondrial dysfunction. Insulin resistance doesn't arise on its own. Its main causes: excess free fatty acids in blood, occurring with overeating and physical inactivity; chronic systemic inflammation; disruption of mitochondria function, organelles that utilize glucose inside the cell. With this dysfunction, the cell loses the ability to efficiently burn glucose and begins responding more poorly to insulin. That's exactly why insulin resistance is so closely connected to chronic inflammation. Fatty tissue, especially visceral, releases pro-inflammatory adipokines, leptin, resistin, IL-6, TNF-alpha. They directly block insulin receptors and disrupt signal transmission inside the cell. That's exactly why reducing visceral fat, even slightly, by 5 to 7% of initial mass, sharply improves metabolic indicators. Exactly, visceral fat is the main source of chronic systemic inflammation. Third mechanism, disruption of insulin receptor function. The insulin receptor consists of several parts. When activated, a cascade of intracellular reactions is launched that ultimately ensures translocation of GLUT4, a special transporter, to the cell surface. Exactly, it pulls glucose inside. With insulin resistance, exactly this chain is disrupted. Either the receptor is less sensitive, or intracellular mediators work more poorly, or GLUT4 doesn't come to the surface in sufficient quantities. Fourth mechanism, fenugreek and galactomannan as carbohydrate absorption retarder. Galactomannan, soluble dietary fiber from fenugreek seeds, forms a gel-like matrix in the stomach and small intestine. This gel physically inhibits digestion and active carbohydrate absorption. Exactly this retardation reduces the postprandial, post-meal, blood glucose peak. There's a good analogy. Galactomannan acts like a net in the intestine through which sugar passes more slowly than usual. Doesn't stop it, slows it down. Exactly this slowdown changes the glycemic curve shape. Instead of a sharp peak, a gentle hill. And a gentle rise requires significantly less insulin release for normalization. A smaller glucose peak, less load on the pancreas. Reduced insulin secretion, decrease of hyperinsulinemia. This is the first application point of fenugreek in insulin resistance. Reducing glycemic response to carbohydrate intake. Fifth mechanism, 4-hydroxyisoleucine and direct influence on receptor sensitivity. 4-hydroxyisoleucine, a unique amino acid found specifically in fenugreek seeds. It acts on two levels. First, stimulates insulin secretion by pancreatic beta cells in a glucose-dependent manner. That is, only when glucose is elevated, eliminating hypoglycemia risk. Second, directly increases insulin receptor sensitivity in muscles and liver, facilitating signal transmission to the GLUT4 transporter. Exactly this makes fenugreek different from simply a retarder of absorption. It also affects receptor sensitivity. There are clinical data confirming this. In randomized studies in people with prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, Regular fenugreek extract intake reduced fasting glucose levels, postprandial peak, and HOMA-IR index compared to placebo. The effect developed gradually, over 8 to 12 weeks of regular use. Exactly such a realistic time frame should be planned when assessing results. Sixth mechanism: chronic sugar spikes in beta cell depletion. With prolonged, uncorrected insulin resistance, pancreatic beta cells work in a constant overload mode. They're forced to produce excessive amounts of insulin for years. This leads to their gradual exhaustion and, ultimately, to reduced insulin secretion, which already looks like glycemic disruption. That's exactly why working with insulin resistance is important as early as possible. Reducing beta cell load preserves their functional reserve. Now about mistakes. The most common ones with first signs of insulin resistance. Mistake 1. Waiting until tests go beyond normal. Many people learn about insulin resistance only when fasting glucose is already elevated or glycated hemoglobin has risen above normal. Meanwhile, by that point, resistance has usually existed for 5 to 10 years. Early checking, HOMA-IR index, fasting insulin, allows detecting disruption years before diabetes develops. Exactly in the compensation period, when the pancreas is still managing, nutritional correction works most effectively. Mistake 2. Considering sweet cravings as weakness of will. People with insulin resistance spend years blaming themselves for inability to just not eat sweets. Meanwhile, their cravings have a biochemical basis. Brain cells under disrupted glucose delivery literally demand a quick energy source. Blaming someone with insulin resistance for sweet cravings is like blaming someone with anemia for fatigue. Correcting the metabolic disruption significantly reduces cravings for fast carbohydrates, without volitional efforts. Mistake 3. Sharply reducing carbohydrates without nutritional support. Ketogenic and low-carbohydrate diets do reduce glycemic load and can improve insulin sensitivity. But sharp carbohydrate reduction without parallel metabolism support often leads to worsened well-being, weakness, headache, irritability. Gradual reduction of dietary glycemic index with simultaneous use of nutrients reducing postprandial peaks. A more physiological and sustainable approach. Mistake 4. Not moving. Physical activity, the most powerful tool for increasing insulin sensitivity from all available. Muscle contractions cause GLUT4 translocation to cell surfaces independently of insulin, meaning muscles can absorb glucose without waiting for the insulin signal. That's exactly why a walk after eating literally reduces postprandial blood glucose peak. 30 minutes of walking or light activity after meals, one of the most proven non-pharmacological tools with insulin resistance. Mistake 5. Ignoring sleep and stress. Chronic sleep deprivation reduces insulin sensitivity already within 3 to 4 days. This is shown in experimental studies. Cortisol with prolonged stress stimulates glycogenolysis in the liver and raises blood glucose. Both factors directly worsen insulin resistance. Mistake 6. Taking fenugreek only when things are bad. Fenugreek as a tool for reducing postprandial peak works preventively. Taken before or during eating, it slows carbohydrate absorption from that specific meal. Taken after eating, the effect is significantly weaker. That's exactly why correct timing is principial. 20 to 30 minutes before the main meal or immediately before it. Now, what actually works at the early stage of insulin resistance? First, check metabolic status with the right tests. Fasting glucose, a necessary but insufficient indicator. Add fasting insulin, HOMA-IR index, glycated hemoglobin, triglycerides, HDL cholesterol. Exactly the combination of high HOMA-IR, high triglycerides, and low HDL with normal glucose. Classic picture of compensated insulin resistance. Exactly this screening allows acting in advance. There's another indicator worth adding to this list: triglycerides to HDL ratio. If above 3, this is one of the most sensitive indirect markers of insulin resistance, not requiring additional tests, calculated from standard lipidogram. Exactly this simple calculation is often missed at standard examination. Second, reduce dietary glycemic index. No need to give up carbohydrates completely. More important, Change their sources and environment. Fiber, protein, and fat in one meal slow carbohydrate absorption. Whole grains instead of refined. Legumes instead of white bread. Exactly these substitutions without calorie counting reduce postprandial peaks, and over time, reduce basal insulin levels. Third, movement after eating. 15 to 30 minutes of walking after lunch reduces postprandial blood glucose peak by 20 to 30% compared to sitting. Muscle contractions create insulin-independent glucose uptake. This doesn't require a gym or special equipment, just a walk. Fourth, fenugreek before main meals. About this in detail in the product section. Fifth, normalize sleep. 7 to 8 hours of sleep every night improves insulin sensitivity. Exactly nighttime sleep is the period of metabolic reboot, restoration of receptor sensitivity, cortisol reduction, normalization of leptin and ghrelin. Even one night of sleep deprivation raises insulin resistance the next day. Sixth, reduce chronic inflammation. Omega-3, curcumin, magnesium, vitamin D. Nutrients with proven anti-inflammatory action that in parallel improve metabolic indicators. Anti-inflammatory nutrition approach. Fish, vegetables, olive oil, minimum of ultra-processed products, creates a systemic background on which any specific interventions work more effectively. Now specifically, about Now Foods fenugreek 500 milligrams and its mechanisms with insulin resistance. Trigonella phonum graecum, Greek fenugreek, one of the most well-studied plants in the context of glycemic control. Two key active components. First component, galactomannan, soluble dietary fiber that forms a gel in the gastrointestinal tract. This gel matrix physically slows gastric emptying and glucose absorption rate in the small intestine. Exactly this ensures a more gradual and slow blood glucose rise after eating, reduction of postprandial peak by 15 to 25%, according to clinical studies data. Second component, 4-hydroxyisoleucine, a unique amino acid specific to fenugreek. Mechanism: direct stimulation of insulin receptor sensitivity in muscle tissue and hepatocytes. Glucose-dependent enhancement of insulin secretion, that is, only with elevated glucose, without hypoglycemia risk. Exactly due to this component, fenugreek works not only as an absorption retarder, but also as a direct insulin receptor sensitizer. Form of release: fenugreek seed extract in capsules. This ensures standardized content of active components, unlike whole powder, where galactomannan concentration can vary significantly. How to take with signs of insulin resistance: 20 to 30 minutes before the main meal, breakfast and lunch, or only lunch if it's the most carbohydrate-rich. Wash down with a glass of water. Galactomannan needs water to form the gel matrix. Without sufficient liquid, the effect will be significantly weaker. First results: reduction of post-lunch drowsiness and reduction of sweet cravings after eating. Many note already within 2 to 4 weeks of regular use. Reduction of basal insulin level and improvement of HOMA-IR within 2 to 3 months. Link to Now Foods fenugreek 500 milligrams extract in the description of this video. https://www.ihherb.com/PR/now-foods-500-mg-100-veg-capsules/610. Insulin resistance begins long before diagnosis. Fatigue after eating, sweet cravings, growing belly with the same diet. This isn't just a lifestyle. These are early metabolic signals that are readable and amenable to correction. 3 concrete steps. Check HOMA-IR, not just glucose, but exactly this indicator. Reduce dietary glycemic load and add movement after eating. Add fenugreek before main meals for reducing postprandial peaks and improving receptor sensitivity. 4th step, give yourself time. Insulin resistance formed over years. 3 to 4 months of regular work, fenugreek, reduced glycemic load, movement. This is a realistic time frame for significant improvement, not 2 weeks. Exactly, consistency and patience here ultimately matter more than any specific product or method. Working with insulin resistance makes sense exactly now, when the pancreas is still managing and the recovery reserve is maximal. And this is the main thing to take away from this video. The symptoms you notice, fatigue after eating, sweet cravings, growing belly with previous diet, this isn't aging and not character. These are metabolic signals that are amenable to correction. Link to fenugreek extract in the description.